Okay, cool. Thanks for coming back, everybody. I think some people had to come in and out as the day requires. Cool. So hopefully you had a chance to try this out. Again, like lots of the point of these exercises is not to like get through everything necessarily. It's mostly to expose you to trying things out, and then you can figure it out, or then you'll understand the when I solve it a little bit better. So, and you'll be able to ask more informed questions. So in the future, things are better, easier to understand. Okay, so we have this. We're trying to build this same experience where I can toggle things on and off with my own button, and so on and so forth. So in our usage example, we're kind of doing the same thing that we were doing with React Context, where the consumer has a render prop API, where the children is actually an interpolation that we're providing a function to, and then that function is going to be called with the state and helpers that we need, and we'll return the JSX that we want. I was just thinking, like, can you imagine what this would have looked like before arrow functions? Boy, I'm like really glad, and destructuring as well. Like in the last couple of years, JavaScript has become so nice. Okay, cool. So I'm going to actually iterate to the final solution. So as I said before this break, the final solution is actually remarkably simple, but we're going to work our way to it so that it's not like a magic, like poof, where'd everything go? So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to make a new function called render UI, and I'm going to move here. I'm going to remove all these comments here first, and I'm going to move this up here, and then in my render method, I'm going to return this.render UI. Okay, and nothing really has changed significant. It's all exactly the same. So I'll tell you when we've done more than just refactor, because every step is just a refactor. It should behave exactly as it was before. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to provide on is this.state.on and toggle is this.toggle, so that we can make this render UI a pure function. It just accepts arguments and returns the React elements it wants to render. So we'll destructure that on and toggle here. Now we don't need to get those from this anymore. We just reference those directly. So there's another refactor. Okay. Next thing we can do, because this is a pure function, we could actually make this a static property of the toggle component, and now we can just do toggle render UI. Okay. Still just a refactor. Nothing super significant has changed. We also don't actually need this to be a static property. Once you have something that's a static property, it actually doesn't need to be a static property. It could just be a regular variable. So what we're going to do is I'm going to move this out, and I'll do const render UI is an arrow function, equals, okay, and then rather than referencing it on toggle, we'll just reference it like normal variables. Okay. Still just a refactor. Nothing has actually changed. We're just moving where the UI is being rendered, where the responsibility for that is. Okay, so now, actually let me move this up above. Now let's see if we can make this this work. We want this.props.render UI. We want it to reference this function still, so what we could do is have a static default props. It's a regular default prop thing from React. We'll say render UI. That's going to be render UI, object shorthand. Thank you for being awesome. So that's some more refactor. Nothing's actually changed. It's just where that's coming from now. But because we can access it from this.props now, we can, in our usage, provide a render UI prop. So I'm going to move this to here. And that actually makes my test pass. So that was not a refactor, that was a change in our usage. But I told you we don't need to change the usage for this to work. So this render UI prop is a render prop. It's just a prop called render UI that renders some UI. So more commonly, you'll see this prop called children. That's what it's called for React context consumers. Downshift supports this. React Router supports this. Yeah, lots of different libraries support the children prop. And because it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense with our new use case to even to not provide the UI that you want rendered for this toggle component, we can get rid of this default implementation and the default props. And now we have a simple render prop component. Cool. So then with our original usage example, we weren't providing the children prop. Children has got a fancy feature where it can be applied to, oops, like this, what's between the opening and closing tags is the children prop. So that was a refactor. And that's render props. So you compare this with the before and after, it's actually pretty simple. It's just what happens in the render method. But hopefully iterating to that point was informative, instructive.
In this case, there is no children.
In this, sorry?
In this case, you don't have the children.
Yeah, so in this case, the toggle component doesn't have any opinions about rendering at all. We could do something like this. If we wanted to render it within a div, we would just do, and now it's inside a div. If we wanted to like do some UI. In addition, render prop doesn't have to be children, and you don't have to only have one. So you can have scenarios where you have like render tab title and render tab contents, and where you're kind of doing a hybrid model of a full-on render prop API with like some opinion about how things are rendered. But the most primitive example of the render prop API is one that doesn't render anything and is just concerned about providing the state and state updaters or the helper functions. Okay? Cool. Does anybody have any other questions about render props? When is it useful? So I find this to be the most useful mechanism for sharing code in React. So anything that's like React-specific logic, this is a perfect use case for that kind of thing. So here at PayPal, I built a component called I can't remember what it was called. PP React something something something. It was just like if you go to it's actually not released yet. But anyway, it's this input that you can type just numbers in. You don't have to worry about decimal separators because internationalization makes that hard. It'll insert those for you. And then if you type too much, it'll like shake the input. It'll say, hey, that's not valid. So lots of little bits of logic that are all like really UI React specific. And so all of that logic I can share with this render prop API, and then I can render my own stuff. So I can render the input, and it also manages the state for the country selector as well, or the currency selector. And so you could render the input and the currency selector right side by side, or you could do one above the other. You can style it however you want to. All of the logic, though, is inside the render prop, or the render prop API component. And so, yeah, when you would use this is anytime you want to share component logic. Yeah, question?
I know that a real simple example, like I have a component that fetches like paginated data. So like you might fetch lists of transactions, or you might fetch lists of users, and like transactions and users are rendered differently. But so the shared component only does the handles of fetching, and what you do is you pass in this render prop that says how to render a user or how to render a transaction. So like it doesn't know anything about the data, how it's fetched, or how it's stored. All it knows is like when I get some data, there's probably going to have to use render prop to
Yep. Yeah, there are a lot of use. In fact, maybe I should have shown this first. Awesome React render props. I'm actually a maintainer on this project, but it's just a big long list of components that expose a render prop API. So like device battery and unstated uses render props, and React value is like a really primitive idea of like you have some arbitrary state and some way to update that arbitrary state. Yeah, React Apollo supports render props. Downshift and React Toggled actually is a fun little experiment that I made that I don't actually use. I've never used it, but I made it, and now it has 29,000 downloads a month. I didn't realize that. I don't know why people use this, but I built it to simplify an example of these patterns because downshift is really complicated, and that was actually the basis for these exercises. But yeah, lots of different use cases for render props. I find that render props are the most primitive form of sharing component logic, and you can build any of these other patterns on top of a component that implements a render prop API. So we could even build the compound components on top of a render prop API. Yeah.
So like when render props first kind of got hot, it was like a lot of times you hear like you can do everything with a render prop and you can do it with a higher order component, but
Yeah.
not vice versa. And I haven't necessarily used like a ton of render props, but so like for example, something that I'll do a lot with higher order components is like I'm using Next.js. I'll have like a with Redux higher order component, and then I might have like a material UI higher order component. I might compose my component so that kind of like I get that, you know, reusability for the nesting of like my component in there.
Mm-hmm.
How would that look with a render prop? Like why, and I guess also like why would that be better? That I don't know if that was like a clear.
Yeah. So what? Why is a render prop better than a higher order component?
Well, I guess like
or?
I can see in certain instances why it would be better when it comes to like dynamic composition and
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that. But like I think for me, my most common use case recently, I mean, at work on Wall, we really don't use this at all, unfortunately. But like on my own projects, I'll use it as like a page wrapper.
Mm-hmm.
So if I have like Next.js example with Redux, is a way to wrap Next with Redux, and then Material UI has their own components. So rather than decorating every page with Material UI component, I'll just reuse that same wrapper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's like the higher order components are great, and there's an exercise for it. At this point, I'm skeptical that we'll make it that far. But you should be able to implement it, and actually higher order components in like the last in 16.3 are a lot easier to make than they were before. Yeah, as far as like which one's better, or so render props are like objectively more flexible, but they do like they often can result in kind of a something that looks like this, where you have this nesting of render props, and it can be kind of weird and wonky, but it does give you a lot more power, and so there are ways to get around this. There's this cool module called React Composer. There's one called React Adopt that I actually like better now, that is like a higher order component that composes multiple render prop components together. So yeah, what like I'm not gonna we don't have time to delve too deep into this, but use a render prop as a talk and a blog post by Michael Jackson where he kind of explains not only why render props are more powerful, but some of the problems with higher order components that render props can kind of help solve. So I would recommend giving that a look later. Any other questions? Okay, cool. So let's jump into the elaboration for your benefit to talk about the things that you learned. and then I'll ask you what you learned, and I'll sit here awkwardly until somebody says something. And then we can move on to the next thing, which will probably be air squats because everybody's tired looking. No. Okay, what did you learn? The pattern. Anything specific? Yeah. But yeah, we don't think about it as. Yeah.
I agree. On reflection, it's kind of obvious. Definitely never known your
Yeah. Yeah. It was odd for me the first time I looked at it too. Something that I'm glad that you brought this up, so I could remember to mention this. But one thing you need to be careful of is the formatting here. It's not really actually a big problem if you're using Prettier, because Prettier will fix this for you. But having a space right here between the greater than symbol and your interpolation actually changes what children is. Now it's an array that has a string as the first element, and then a function as the second element, and then a string of a single space as the last element. So that's kind of wonky. So luckily, like, I'm using Prettier, so I saved this in it. Well, actually, yeah, Prettier's like, oh, you wanted a space there? Let me make that more explicit.
Is there a reason why React does that? Like, is there a use case for it?
Yeah, there's totally a use case. Like, I find this especially if I'm like, click a href here. So with that, there is no space between click and here, and so that's not good. So you want to have like an explicit space there, or like you'll want to have. Whoops.
Well, I meant with like turning it into an array. Like, why would React?
Why would React turn it into an array?
Yeah.
So if I do this, right? So children needs to be an array now, right? Because it's a collection. So what's odd about it is that React ever does anything other than make it an array. And so if you want to be really safe about it, then what you could do is you do something like const UI equals array is. Actually, I think React has a built-in react.children.only, and it'll ensure that this .props.children is only like one element, and that you just get that one element. I don't really use it because I like, especially with render props, most of the time your React components can also support Preact, and if you're going to use React specific APIs like that, then you can't. So I'll do just like a little simple snippet to just block off the one thing. In Preact, it's always an array, and so I just ensure that it is an array, and then I pluck off the first item off of it. So yeah, kind of funny, interesting things there. But yeah, children could be a string, could be null, could be function, and with that you can call it. Cool. Thanks for sharing. Okay, so this afternoon, around like in about an hour, is when all workshop attendees start to like die. Not really, no. Like you don't have to run away. He said he was gonna die. No, you're not gonna die, but you get like kind of tired, and so what that just telling you that from my experience. So we can do things one of two ways. So I can either just work through some of these with you watching and asking questions. Some of the ones that I think may be a little less necessary for you to work through the exercises. And then we can get through more material and it's a little less draining on your brain. Or we could just keep going like we're doing. So which would you rather do? If we keep going like we're doing, we'll probably make it to like number 7, which is state initializers. That means we'll miss out on state reducers, which is like one of the coolest ones. We might get to state reducers. But yeah, but if I just work through it and you ask questions, then we could probably get through most of it. So anyway, with that in mind, which would you prefer? So you want to get, who wants to get through all of it? Okay, who wants to keep doing exercises? Who's looking at Twitter? No, just kidding. Okay, I think we'll still do some exercises for the things that like I think are really important for you to grapple with a little bit. But for some of these, I'll just work through it, and you can ask questions. And I'll try to keep up with questions on the chat here for some people because they might ask some really useful questions. Yeah, for that one, read the blog post that I referenced. I solved that. Okay, cool. So for number 5, if we look at the app, this is prop collections. Nothing really has changed here in our implementation. But if we look at exercise, then we can see our usage has changed. So actually, let's look at the usage here first. We have a switch, which ultimately renders a button, and a button. And both of these are taking an on-click prop. And actually, the button is missing an ARIA pressed prop. So if we were going to properly ARIA pressed equals on. So for accessibility reasons, we probably need that. So the switch component itself will take care of the ARIA pressed. Well, I thought it did. Where is that? Okay, it does. Maybe. It should. Anyway, somebody actually filed a pull request to make it more accessible. I thought it did. In any case, there are lots of times when you're using render prop or where you're exposing a render prop API to people where they'll be rendering, like there are very common use cases. Probably a better example of this would be downshift, where I kind of came up with this prop collections idea. Actually, this is Jared Forsyth gave me this idea, where a autocompletes, you'll have an input, probably better to show this. You'll have an input, you'll have a button to clear things, you'll have a button to open and close the menu, and so there, oh, and you'll have like the menu itself, you'll have items in the menu. So like your component probably has common use cases, common elements that are going to be rendered. You don't have any control over that, and that's fine, that's good. But most of the time when people use your thing, they're going to want to apply certain props to certain elements to make things work. So like with us right now, we expose the toggle function, and that's just enough that we need for consumers to be able to control the state and everything. But there are some common scenarios where you're going to be applying props to certain elements. And it would be nice to provide some sort of convenience for that. And so that is what exercise 5 is all about, is we're going to have a toggler props object that you can spread across your switch or any other thing that you want to render for the toggler, the thing that's responsible for toggling the state. Okay, so yeah, in the spirit of getting through things, I'm going to work through implementing this for you. So the way that I implemented the renderProp API, and what I often do is I'll make a function called getState and helpers, and that will be responsible for getting the object that I'll be calling the children with. So inside of here, I'm going to add the toggler props object, and this is what people should apply, the props people should apply to their toggler buttons. So we'll have an onClick is this .toggle, and we'll have and notice that I'm not removing the toggle, so they still have total control over like toggling that imperatively or however they want to, however else they want to. So this isn't in replacement of anything else. It's just a convenience. So you have an onClick, and we'll also have an aria pressed is this .state.on, and yeah, that's actually it. That's all. Okay, does that make sense?
Help us to understand what does aria press mean.
Yeah, that's just for accessibility purposes, because this the button that people are going to render is going to be a toggle button, and aria pressed communicates that to screen readers, because like people who are blind don't know that this button is a toggle button necessarily, because you communicate that visually with like, you know, it's darker when it's pressed and it's lighter when it's not, right? So it's easier for people who can see, but for those who cannot or have a hard time seeing, they use a screen reader, and this communicates to the screen reader what the purpose of this button is.
In general, it's just an attribute that needs to be rendered to the tag.
Exactly. Yeah. So actually, I can give you an example. It's kind of a spoiler a little bit, but in downshift, we look at this. So here, these are the input props. So if you want to render an input with downshift, which most of the time you will, lots of accessibility relevant stuff, especially with autocompletes. You want to have what's the active descendant, the item that's currently highlighted, the value of that input, any event handlers. Yeah. In general, like exactly like you said, in general, it's just props that are common for that particular use case. Okay, cool. So now we run into a new problem, though. So we are providing an onClick for our toggler props. And let's say that I wanted to provide my own onClick. So I'm going to say onClick, and this will alert you clicked. Okay, so now if I go here if I click on this, it's going to alert you clicked, but it's not going to toggle anymore. Does anybody know why that's happening? Why it's not working anymore? So I provided, sorry? Yeah, it overrided the onClick that comes from toggler props. So we can see this more clearly if we swap those, and now toggler props comes second. And now my alert doesn't happen anymore. So there are a couple ways we can solve this. For one, we could make this come after, and then we'll make this a little bit more complicated with toggler props.onClick. And that actually fixes it. We can do both. But a couple of reasons I don't like that is because now the part of the reason that prop collections are so useful is because you don't have to know what it's applying to your element. And so maybe in the future we say, oh, onClick doesn't really make sense, we're going to change it to onKeyDown or something like that. Anything, it's all just implementation details. And if you make any changes here, then it could be a breaking change for anybody who's using your component in that way. In addition, this is like not very fun to write. That's kind of dumb. I don't like that. So I would much rather have some mechanism by which I can compose my props with the props that are provided. And so what we're going to do here, and this is what exercise 6 is all about, is we're going to make a new API called getTogglerProps that does supersede the TogglerProps API. And it accepts any of the additional props we want to apply to our element. So rather than applying onClick to the button, we're going to provide onClick to our getTogglerProps, and it will be responsible for composing all the behavior together and returning all of the props, including the ones that we want to have applied. So this ID, the ARIA label, if it doesn't care about them, then it's not going to make any changes, it'll just return them. Okay? Okay, so for this one, it is, like I said, it is going to supersede the TogglerProps. I'm going to make it an instant or a class method, so we'll have getTogglerProps. And this is going to, actually no, it's going to be an instance method, because it could be called off of the instance. So it's going to accept any props, and then it's going to return those props, plus the ones that we want to have applied. Okay? And then we'll say getTogglerProps is this dot getTogglerProps. Okay, so with that now, we're not actually composing things. We're just taking this object and overriding it with our own props and providing any of the ones that they're providing. So we're merging the props they're providing with the ones that we want, but we're not composing things together yet. So this is what we're going to do. I'm going to actually destructure this. Will have all of these props, so functionally equivalent so far. But we're going to pull off any on-click that people are going to provide. Okay, so now props doesn't include the on-click that they provided. We're going to make our on-click an arrow function that does exactly what we were doing. So we'll call their on-click with the args that an on-click normally gets. And this is actually going to break. We're running the wrong test, 06. Well, and we're running on the wrong file. Okay, forget the tests. How do I make this go away? Go away. Minimize. Oh, that worked. I don't know if it's still running, but that's weird. Okay, so this is actually going to break because our switch is not providing an onClick, so we're calling undefined. So we'll say onClick. So if onClick is defined, then we'll evaluate the rest of the expression and invoke onClick. In addition, we'll provide a default for our getTogglerProps, so you can call it without providing any props. Maybe you don't need any. Okay, so this actually works, and if we go back to exercise 6 here, then we're going to get both of our functionality. We can look in the that on button click is what we're looking for. That's the custom functionality, and in addition to actually toggling. So that works, but let's refactor this a little bit further to make it a little nicer, because this is probably, in a real world component, this isn't the only time you're going to need to compose these functions together like this. So what we're going to do is, I have this handy utility called callAll, which accepts any number of functions as its argument. So we'll do callAll on click and this dot toggle. So it accepts any number of functions, so function 1, function 2. We could do any more if we wanted to. And that returns a function, which we're going to assign to the onClick property on this object. And that function will take all the arguments that it's given, and for each of the functions that it was constructed from, we're going to call it if it exists, and we'll call it with all the arguments. Okay? So that's kind of handy. It means our onClick will have all of the we'll call all of these functions if they're provided. And yeah, and things are working. Ta-da! On button click. So this is called prop getters, and I pretty much never use prop collections. I just use prop getters because they're, in my mind, they're like way better. So, any questions about the prop getters stuff? Okay. Cool. So our next thing, state initializers. Oops. And then after this one, I think we'll maybe take a break. Get up and walk around. Okay, so we have just what we had before, but now in our usage, we want to have a reset button. Let's actually take a look at the state initializers thing. So here in our final version, we can turn it on and off, and then reset. It'll take us back to our original state. So in downshift, we definitely have something like this. So you can reset the state of downshift, it closes the menu, clears out the item that is selected, all of that stuff. And we want to support that here. But it doesn't work because reset's not a function. Right there. So let's go ahead and make that work. This is going to come from our state and helpers, which we have right here. And we'll need a reset. So we'll say reset is this dot reset. We'll need to create that function. I'll put it right under toggle here. And we'll call this dot set state. And our initial state is on is false, so I'll just say on is false. And then we also have a new API or a new prop for on reset that we want to be able to call on reset with. So as a second argument to set state, we'll say this dot props dot on reset. Well, actually, we want to call it with the current state, so we'll make it an arrow function and then call this dot props dot on reset with this dot state dot on. Okay, cool. So that actually should work. Ta-da! Okay, pretty simple, but there are a couple of additional things that I like to do when using this state initializers. Actually, one thing that this isn't doing right now is our usage expects to be able to initialize the on state. This would be like default value for an input where you can initialize it to some value, and then it doesn't care what that is, that prop is for the rest of the life of the component. So if I initialize on to false, then to true, then I want it to start out as true. So how do we do that? Well, we just come up here to our state, we say this dot props dot initial on, and now we can have it initialized as true. And when I click that, I click reset, and oh no, I forgot to update my set state call. So this is what I like to do to avoid that kind of a problem. I'll have an initial state, and that is going to be equal to this, and then we'll set the state property to this dot initial state, and then when we call reset, we'll just do this dot initial state. And so now we can update our that initial state to whatever else, like we're adding new state to this component, we're making changes to it, how it works, whatever. And the reset will always reset us to what the state was when our component was constructed. So now we can turn that off and click reset, and it'll reset us to that initial state. So that's state initializers. You can have, I pretty much have something like this for every prop that, or for every item of state for my components when that use case seems relevant. You might also call this a default, so default on, default off, or default whatever the state name is. Okay, cool. So what questions do you have about state initializers? The questions really die down when you don't do exercises anymore, which is a shame. But okay, why don't we take a break for like 10 minutes? Actually, you know what? No. This is what we'll do. I'll introduce the next exercise, and then we'll take a break combined with the exercise. Okay, but I'll make you take the break, because if you don't, then I mean, take care of yourselves, people. Okay, cool. So here's number 8, state reducers. Now this is one when I didn't invent this. This is pre-existing in React Reason actually, but I hadn't heard of it before, and I came up with it in downshift, and it just it simplified so many things. So I really like this pattern a lot. so far we've been talking about giving flexibility to the consumers of our components in UI, from a UI perspective. They can control the way things are rendered. This allows us to, for consumers to have control over how the state is managed. So now we're talking about logic, not just UI. In general, I find this more useful in combination with the render prop API, but this could totally be useful even if you're not using render props. So in our case, we're building on what we had before. We have that initial state and the state, and we're calling the children with the state and helpers. But our usage example has become significantly different. So let's see what things look like with the state reducers. So the final version, I click on it once and it shows the click count. Click on it again and again and again. And once I get to 4, and I try to click again, it says, whoa, 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 you clicked too much. Stop clicking until you click reset, and then it starts over. Okay. Okay, so that is what we're going to support. The way that works is we have we're managing our own state in our usage, where we initialize it to times click to 0. And then we have an on toggle handler on the toggle, so every time you toggle, we're going to update the times clicked. And we'll also do this reset, so we're doing sort of the state initializers thing for like the usage example as well. And then here's where the magic happens on the consumer side. So they have this state reducer, which we're passing to the state reducer prop on our on toggle. That's where you're going to be implementing, is supporting this. So the toggle state reducer accepts all of the state, the current state, and all of the changes that we're suggesting we make. So for us, it's kind of simple because it's just one item of state. But for downshift, there's surprisingly fewer items of state too. It's actually only 4. Is open, input value, highlighted item, and what was that fourth one? Selected item. Okay, so it doesn't actually need more than just 4 items of state, which is, to me, that's really surprising. I would expect it to need a lot more, but it doesn't. In our case, we just have 1. So the state is only ever going to have on, and changes will only ever have on. But in any case, we're going to say if the usage instance state has times clicked greater than or equal to 4, then we'll prevent that, or we'll be fine with whatever other changes you want to make, but I want to make sure that the on state will always be false. So you're trying to change it from false to true. I'm going to say no, it's got to stay false. Otherwise, we'll just let you do your changes as you want. And yeah, and that's how you use the state reducer pattern. So how you implement it is your job, and Cody the Koala Bear is here to help. So why don't we spend like 5 minutes, just get up and walk around or whatever, and then we'll do like 15 minutes on this exercise. This one's this one's not going to be easy. You might not finish even in 15 minutes, and that's totally cool. But it's a really powerful pattern. So we'll come back at 1:35. Oh yeah, and for anybody who doesn't know, you'll go to 08, swap out the final for the usage from the exercises, and then in your terminal, you run npm run test, and then if you want to just run 8, you hit the P key, letter P, 08. That'll run 08. And once the tests are passing, you're probably good to go.
hate it. I hate it. I get, I really rest my home, but I hate it on my computer too.
You know which one? Eight. Did they skip all of them?
The others? No, he went.
Oh, okay.
How are things coming for folks? Anybody finish already? Cool.
the information if there's not a single comment to this file. I'll just go in everything's wrong. Because I wait, it's all. Yeah, so there's a lot of code and no comment. Sure.
Anyway, if, like when you're working through this, if there are like things that were confusing that I could make more clear in the comments or something, definitely leave me feedback. What we have today is a result of doing this workshop twice already, and people leaving really useful feedback. And like so, I've added comments to make things more clear for everybody. So the more clear I can make things through comments, the better. Or even like changes to the examples a little bit. Okay, who's ready to go through the solution? I'm actually not going to see if you answer yes or no, because we're going to go through the solution. I shouldn't have asked, sorry. No, I'm not ready. Sorry. Okay, so here we are on state reducers. They're awesome. I love them. So let's see what we've got to do to make this a thing. It's kind of cool. Okay, so we need to accept a prop called state reducer, and then anytime we're going to call this .setState, we need to take any of the changes that we want to make. Like these, you could consider these objects our change proposals. So we're proposing these changes to be made, and we need to pass that first to our state reducer so that it can give us back the changes that we actually are going to be making. Okay. So there are a couple of ways we could accomplish this. The easiest way is instead of calling setState, we're going to call internal setState. We're going to make our own setState function. So we'll make an internal setState, and that's going to be a function that accepts our changes and our callback. And we'll call this .setState changes callback. And then we can update these two, the internal setState. Okay, so far we've just refactored, haven't done anything actually useful. So we're going to change, so the changes could actually be an object or it could be a function. So in the case of internal or reset, it's going to be an object, but for the toggle, it needs to get the current state and so that it knows what the new state should be, or what it should suggest the new state to be. And so so we can't just say, okay, we'll do const new changes equals this dot props dot state reducer is changes. Can't just do that. Well, it'd be this dot state and then changes. So that would work for reset, but that doesn't work for toggle, because toggles is a function, and we don't want our state reducer to have to call the function. So we're going to handle that ourselves. Also, in the case of like batching, then this dot state isn't reliable anyway. So we need to get the current state. So we're going to actually change this to, we'll call it just state. And we'll just move that there, comment it out really quick. And now we need to get the changes object. So we'll say changes object equals changes type of function. Oops. So if the changes is a function, then we'll call changes with the state. Otherwise, it'll be just changes. Okay. And I need to learn how to write JavaScript. Ha! There we go. Okay, so now we have a changes object, and we can get our, we'll call this reduced changes with that state reducer. And instead of this dot state, because that's unreliable, we'll just do regular old state that we're getting from our state updater. And then we'll pass the changes object. And that reduced changes is what we're going to return. There we go. So we're giving the state reducer an opportunity to make changes to our changes based off of the recommended changes. So we recommend that you toggle on to false, but whatever you want to do, that's what we'll do. Okay, and unless I'm missing something critical, that should have us passing our tests. Yep. And then ultimately our usage example here. So now this thing works. Ta-da! Okay, what questions do you have about state reducers? Why would you ever use it? Yeah. So the use cases are like actually huge. In particular for downshift, as just our example of the day, let's say that like when I focus on the input, that actually performs a set state call, and as a consumer, let's say that I want the no, this is a bad example. When I arrow down, that performs a set state call to open the menu. Let's say that I don't want that to happen as a user of downshift. I don't want people to be able to open the menu by arrowing down. Okay, so then I'll add a state reducer that says, okay, so you're opening the menu. I'm actually going to prevent that. There's an extra piece to this that we'll explore next, which adds a type so that you know, like, why is a state change being made, so that you can differentiate between clicking on this and arrowing down, because that would be important in that kind of scenario. But that's one situation where you might want to have a state reducer. Just gives you a ton of flexibility over how state is managed in the component. Because like for a component to be useful, it has to make some opinions, but then making those opinions overridable is what makes your component really flexible. Any other questions? Okay, cool. So go ahead and solidify what you learn with the elaboration and feedback. I didn't do this for the ones that I just showed you because maybe I should have, but I didn't, sorry. But for this one, yeah, definitely do that. Okay, so what did you learn other than how to do the pattern?
A lot of flexibility. Yeah, only can be very flexible. Easily extendable to some crazy thing.
Yeah.
But you have to make sure that the extensibility of that thing will not break the whole thing.
Yeah, that's true.
Be flexible.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that. So it can feel like you can overdo it on the flexibility here a little bit. And so one problem that somebody's presented me with the state reducer pattern is just the fact that it kind of breaks encapsulation, because like the whole idea of this state thing is that it's an internal implementation detail, and now we've exposed that implementation detail to consumers. And so it's a trade-off between do I want to provide this kind of flexibility, or like let's say that there are only a couple situations where somebody would ever want to use a state reducer. Maybe I just provide a special prop just for that scenario, like just for that use case. In the case of like complex components like downshift, there are infinite different reasons why somebody might want to change the internal logic of downshift, like different use cases. And so adding a special if statement for every single one of those use cases would grow out of control. And so the trade-off of breaking encapsulation there is fine. So the problem with breaking encapsulation, though, is that now if I refactor my state, like what the state is called even, that's actually a breaking change now. So it's not a refactor, it's actually like a breaking change. So you do have to be careful about that. You could potentially still make some things backward compatible and things. I suppose do some extra magic in your internal set state function. But yeah, you do need to be cognizant of the fact that people are now relying on what the state is. Another thing that's kind of interesting and that you could also deal with is in here there's nothing stopping me from adding other stuff to the state of that component. Like I can do whatever I want. And every time you call set state, I can add things, I can change things to the state of that component. Which could be a good thing, but it's probably not a good thing. So that would be something else you could potentially clean up too, is just remove all the stuff that isn't on the state. We'll actually be doing that a little bit after or for the next exercise. So, any other questions
Not a question. Maybe,
or comments? Yeah.
maybe it means I'm not advanced, but I didn't realize set state would pick up function.
Yeah, that's pretty common. You're not alone. Lots of people don't realize that set state takes a function. That's actually really important. Yeah, it's good to know and take advantage of, because set state is not synchronous. It's batched. So
that's why we will use the function.
Mm-hmm.
The initial first one only I was like confused with it. So because it's a batch, we'll use, but you also have force update.
So a force update, I'm not sure whether that's synchronous, but yeah, it's not generally a good idea to use that, because if you're using force update, then you're probably mutating stuff, and that's not advisable. You should just store everything that needs to be re-rendered in state, and then when state is changed, it'll re-render itself. There are situations where it makes sense to use force update, but yeah, if you can avoid it, it's better.
So when to use function and when sorry.
So if you don't like complicated rules, always use a function. There will not be any noticeable performance degradation for using a function in set state.
And, it will be synchronous or asynchronous?
It will always be. I don't like saying it's asynchronous. It will not happen when you think it does, because it's batched. So technically it's yeah. So set state, when like you call set state, but then when it's actually run is at a different time. So we can call set state here. This dot set state whatever. But if we immediately thereafter this dot state dot high, that's going to be undefined because it doesn't happen right away. Okay, and that's why you use a function callback. So, like I said, if you don't like confusing rules, then just always use a function. But if
you define a function, it will be there.
if you define a function, then you'll get the current state at the time that your set state call is being executed in the batch execution. So, okay, I should probably make a advanced React course that's like not patterns, but just like stuff like this. This is a pretty common question. Okay, cool. So actually, that's anyway. So we have a bit of a problem with our current implementation of state reducers because, like we were talking about with downshift, I can open the menu various ways. I can arrow down, I can click on the toggle button, I can start typing, I can do a lot of different things to make that open. And if I wanted to just say I don't want people to be able to arrow down and open the menu, then I would have no way of distinguishing between an arrow down and a click on the toggle button to open the menu. Yeah, well, so our state reducer doesn't get the event information. It just gets the state and the changes. So there's really nothing that we're providing. So what we're going to do is we're going to provide a mechanism by which components can know what kinds of changes are being made. And that is in exercise 9. So this is state reducer with types. So just kind of because this is a contrived example, there's really only one way to update the state. Well, pretty much. Here's our usage example, just to give you an idea of what the use case is. So I click on this, and it clicks up to 4, and it says, hey, you clicked too much. Now we're also rendering this force toggle button, and I can continue to toggle even though I can't actually click the toggle, right? So I have one mechanism by which I can update that state. And my state reducer has to differentiate between when I click force toggle and when I click on the toggle button so that it knows whether to allow that change to take place. Ooh. Oh, yeah. So I'm going to start pelting you with tokens. Just kidding. But yeah, feel free to come up and get a JS at PayPal token. I'd give those to the live streamers, but we haven't invented that technology yet. So, come on, Elon Musk. Just kidding. Okay, so yeah, so that's what we're going to be building. Right now, the functionality is it doesn't work. You need to make it work. So, what time is it? Yeah, I think we could do the exercise for this one. So, yeah.
On the get top level props, one output. Yeah, the actual call at the function call.
You mean where the function is defined?
Yeah, the unclick. You don't take the unclick, you don't care about that on key. And you give the call off that unclick.
Why don't we chat after I get people started on this exercise? Yeah, okay, so for the way that we want to be able to do this is I want to be able to call toggle with a type, and I also want every time my state reducer is called, I want those changes to include a type so that I can differentiate between the different types. So when I call on toggle, I call it with a type, then that type should be made accessible to me. But also I'd want to be able to say if change it, oh, what on earth? Phi is like a for in, I guess. IF. So if changes dot type is reset, then I'd want to be able to do something else. Anytime that you're going to call my state reducer, I want you to add a type property to the changes object. And so from the implementation standpoint, what you're going to be doing is where you call internal set state, you're going to call that with an object or with a function that returns an object. That object should have a type property on it. Okay, and that's pretty much it. There is this should be extra credit. You don't have to remove the type property, but if you want to, you can. One thing that I added to this that I didn't talk about was this object.keys thing. So the reason that we're doing this is if I'm returning an object to set state, that's actually going to re-render. But if I return null from set state, then that doesn't re-render. If you're just returning an object, no state is changing anyway, so you don't need a re-render. And so what I'm doing here is I'm saying, hey, if it's just an empty object, then just return null so it doesn't re-render. So sorry I didn't show you that earlier. Okay, so I'll give you, we'll do like 7 minutes or so on this one. Yeah, 7 minutes, so it'll be 2 o'clock. And then we'll come back together on this. So to get things started, we'll hit P09 and test 09. Oops. Swap these and test for failing. Go team.
So right now, so this doesn't call it.
All right, so you use this one.
Yeah, that's just think it was under so that's operations. Number 6 is where we had it. Something off the
for producer where the client is consuming the web, the web is consuming like they want to pass it on to producer, maybe extensive or
Is it written on Redux?
yes, Redux, not on the system, I mean not on the components. So we like apply these kind of patterns there so that they can write their own component and change in their own state. Or they can use the Redux reducer. I think we even support the combined reducer. So we use base reducer, like the library provides. The GRC is some application which they have. They can inject the reducer.
So you're saying the library provides Redux reducers?
Yeah, base one.
So,
basic one.
so why does the library need access to Redux?
The library is combined of React components and the Redux. Both.
Okay, so, but why does the library need Redux?
Because that is someone maintaining in their state, right?
So this is a common mistake that I'll see is that when libraries that are supposed to be reusable components need access to the application state, most of the time they don't. So like for example, this very simple, but this common component is maintaining its own state. And if you want access to that state, then you can just have a prompt that is the on-top.
Because our 80% of the components are container components. It's all connected.
Okay,
It's just
right, but when are those
connected because it's all JSON driven. Okay. So that in JSON you specify this is the global states variable. You want to this is the UPA response. I want access it from the JSON.
Is there a reason that you can't just pass those as prompts?
You can pass it as a prompt.
But so that's I see this all the time. Is trying to because we're so used to using Redux for application components that we start putting that in the libraries. I've never seen a situation where I was do that. So yeah, that's what that is.
But in that case, right now what we have already in production. So it's
Yeah. So how do you change it?
so how do you make it extensible to the client? So it's a new client. They want to pass in their users. They want to pass in action creator for their users, or even they want to override one of our components.
I would have to really look into it.
Sure.
It's a pretty chunky time. So I don't know what to say.
Sure.
Yeah, you could provide a reducer prompt to components or something like that, similar to this, I guess. But yeah, I don't know how to clean that up. I'd have to really.
Yep.
All right, did anybody finish? Okay, it's okay. We want to keep moving on, I think. Or unless, do you want me to give you time to finish, or would you prefer to blaze ahead? I'm mostly seeing let's blaze ahead. I'm actually only seeing let's blaze ahead. Everybody else is like tired. So maybe after this we'll do some air squats because I forgot to do that earlier. So to make this work, we're going to make this go away. And yeah, it's actually fundamentally pretty simple. So here, instead of, whoops, what just happened? Yeah, instead of just passing this object, we're going to create a new object that spreads those properties and then adds a type. Call it reset. Reset. And then we'll add a type to our toggle. Call it toggle. And then, like, fundamentally, that's as far as we need to go. But we do want to allow people to pass their own type when they call toggle. So we're going to accept an argument that has a type property, and we'll default that argument to an empty object. They don't have to call it with anything, but we'll default this to toggle, and then we'll pass that there. So if you don't pass this a type, it's just going to be toggle. Okay, so here's a tiny little problem with this is on click, this call all is going to call every one of these functions with the event, and the event actually happens to have a type. And so for this, we're going to turn that into an arrow function so we can call it just like that. Okay, cool. So that is as far as we actually need to go to make things work. And there is, well, so that gets us our first little bit, and actually our functionality works properly. Okay, so that's great, but there's an optimization here, and that is our type now has, or our state now has a toggle or a type property. The problem with that is, I guess Sean is done. The problem with that is we could potentially re-render unnecessarily, and so we can because you could click on a toggle, or you could reset. Here, actually, that's probably the best example. So if I click this, click that, and then I click reset, then I don't actually need to re-render the toggle component, but it will re-render because the type changed, and we don't need it to do that. So what we can do then is we're going to pluck off the type, and I'll just call that ignored type, and then get the only changes that equals the reduced changes. And then we'll just use only changes. And now we can avoid that unnecessary re-render. Okay. Neat. Good. Somebody actually in the chat asked, what could we do to avoid people mucking up with our state? Like they can call, with their state reducer, they could return anything. And so one thing that we could do to solve kind of both these problems is have a function that can take our object and only pluck off only those properties that we have in our state already. So in our case, that's just the on property. And that way, people return any nonsense that they want. We'll only take the ones that belong in the state. So we could add that, but I didn't have that in here, so I'm not going to get distracted by that. But you could also actually probably not be a bad idea to warn somebody if do a console warn if they try to do that, because they're probably trying to make something work and it's not supposed to work that way. And so be a friendly little message.
I found a bug.
You found a bug? Okay, show me later. Once I start this next exercise, I want to see that. Okay, cool. So go ahead and reiterate what you learned to the computer. Fill out this quick form, and then we'll move on to the next thing, which I believe is control props. Yeah, it's gonna be great. So what did you learn? Anybody learn anything? Nobody learned anything. Now everybody's tired. Oh, so somebody online learned the syntax here, which is kind of cool. Being able to pluck off properties. It's the rest are on objects. That's handy. Yeah. Anything else anybody want to mention that they learned? Often when you say what you learned, I can expound on that and we get some additional good stuff. So
I'm still kind of digesting Adam, if that makes sense.
yeah, okay. Is that I mean
kind of like reduxy, but without the redux, because it's essentially that type signature.
Yeah, exactly. You have the reducer, and now we have a type.
Yeah.
So you could like go full on Redux and make a payload and like the
type is essentially the payload.
Yeah. So you could instead of these state changes, you could have a type and then a payload property, and then like you could go full on Redux if you wanted to. That'd be super weird, but we could actually manage our state using Redux in this component if we wanted to.
That's kind of where it feels. It's like kind of. I mean, it's not, but it is. Since that's what I'm digesting.
Yeah. So I have toyed around with the idea of just providing a function that calls this .set state to here, so we can have something like set state is an arrow function args this internal set state args. And people have like, yeah, do whatever you want. And I don't think that's a terribly bad thing to do necessarily. It gives you a lot of flexibility. You can really shoot yourself in the foot that way too. But it does give a lot of flexibility. And thanks to React, like it actually isn't all that bad, I think, to do something like that. Okay, cool. So control props. How many people have ever used a controlled input before? Okay. So can you describe what a controlled input? Actually, when this is recorded on YouTube, people won't be able to hear you. So I'll go ahead and describe the controlled input. Let's say that you have an input and you want people to be able to type in it, but you want whatever they type to be uppercase, all uppercase, even if they don't have like caps lock on. You just always want it to be uppercase. So how would you do that? Well, you'd have to pass a value prop to the input. So it'd be yep, exactly. Yeah. So here we'll have a value is like this dot state dot input value, and then you'd have to know when the user's making a change, then you have to provide an on change prop, and this would be called this dot handle input change, and in your handle input change, you're going to call this dot set state. Input value is you're going to get an event and target. Yeah. Right. That's valid syntax. Thank you, Prettier. Yeah. So that's how you would accomplish this with an input. So that whatever they type, it's always going to be uppercase. So this is controlled props. That's the value prop is a control prop. It means that as soon as you provide this prop, the input will no longer be maintaining its own internal state. Before that, it's maintaining state to know what should be set to the value of the input. So I'm not exactly sure how it's implemented in React, but I like to think of it as the input is a component that has a state property for the value, and then as there are changes, it updates that state property for the value, and then can re-render that value to the input. So something like that. But as soon as you pass the value prop, what would happen if I were to render an input with a value prop that doesn't have an on change? Has anybody seen the error in the console that you get when you do that? It says something like this input will only be read-only. You need to provide an on change if you provide a value. It's a controlled input. And that's because there's no mechanism, as far as the input is concerned, there's no mechanism for updating the value based off of what the user is typing. But just because React is telling us what it thinks the value should be based off of the changes that are, or the user interaction, doesn't mean we have to set the input to that value. So what React is doing is it's giving us a suggestion of what it thinks our input should be, what the input value should be, and then leaving everything else up to us on how to update that state, how to manage that. So when we provide a value prop to an input, it gives us 100% control over the state. We're in charge. And it will make suggestions to us on what it thinks or what types of changes it thinks we should be making, but we don't have to make those changes at all. So that's control props. You can actually implement control props for your component, and anything you can do with the state reducer you can actually do with control props. So long as you provide a control prop for every item of state that you have. The problem is that it's a lot, or the reason why I still have a state reducer or support a state reducer in downshift is because it's actually a lot simpler than control props. With control props, now you have to maintain your own version of that state and keep that updated and stuff. But it is a slightly more powerful API. Okay, cool. So we're going to implement this same thing for our toggle. So I've simplified things considerably. It's actually not even a render prop anymore. It's just rendering the switch. And in our usage example here, we're keeping these two toggles in sync. So this is one thing that a control prop can do that a render or a state reducer can't do, is the state reducer can only change the state when a set state call is made. A control prop can change the state even when nothing has happened inside that component. So I'm not clicking on this one, clicking on this one, and it's updating the on state anyway, right? So objectively more powerful. So the way that we're accomplishing this in our usage is the usage is managing some state. It has a both on state. And just ignore the ref stuff. That's for my testing purposes. What really matters here is that we're rendering two toggle components. They both have an on toggle, and those are both past the handle toggle callback, which will update the both on to whatever that state should be. And then it re-renders, and then the both on state is passed to the on prop from toggle. Okay? And so whatever the on prop is what that toggle's on state should be. So from as soon as the on prop appears on the toggle's this.props, then the state should now come from props and not from state. Okay, so it should now be where it's rendering or any logic that it has, it should be getting that information from props and not state. Okay, one mistake that people make when they try to do something like this is they try to use component will receive props and synchronize internal state with props. That can lead to some like unnecessary re-rendering and some other out of sync problems. It's normally more complicated. And so what's better is what the comments are going to show you how to solve this problem. There's a bunch of extra credit for this one. I will probably work through that extra credit with you. But yeah, we probably won't have time for you to get through much or any of the extra credit anyway. So, but if you're lightning fast, you have lots of stuff to do. So other than that, though, just a couple methods you need to implement in here, and then some changes to the toggle and changes to the render. Any questions? Okay, cool. So let's get our test running for exercise 10. You'll swap the exercise final with the exercise, and then hit the P key for the pattern of 10. That should get you going. For this one, I think we'll go we'll do 15 minutes. Do you want to have more time so that you can actually finish this one? Or you're all starting to work on it already? I forgot to do the air squats thing. Yeah, I think we'll go for 15 minutes. So about 2:30. And we're also I'm gonna ask everybody to stop really quick so we do air squats really fast. Everybody stand. This is the best. Okay, great. I hope those watching at home can join us here. Okay, arms out in front of you and count out loud with me. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Awesome. Feel free to stretch. Stretch your fingers too, because we're using our fingers all day. And your arms. Give yourself a big hug. This actually, if you really do it, it releases oxytocin, and it's good for you. Just kind of fun. Okay, go ahead and enjoy the exercise. I'm not joking. Like, this is science. Yeah, it's got to be serious. It's not this awkward, like, he's doing this because he's, yeah.
forgot how long I said I was going to do all. Probably 2:30, so 4 more minutes. So just by way of like overview, we have the control props, and this is the only exercise I'm going to have you do for control props. I'll walk you through the rest of this, the extra credit stuff, which is actually pretty significant. So we'll get through some good material there, and then we'll have the provider pattern and then higher order components. Don't worry about missing higher order components. They're like old news. I'm just kidding. It's still kind of interesting. So yeah, the provider pattern is actually pretty straightforward. You've kind of already experienced some of that with the compound component stuff. So I think maybe I'll work through the provider pattern and higher order components, because I think we're all, even after that air squats, I think everybody's still kind of tired. So yeah, we'll probably finish at like 3:30 in the next hour. Maybe 4. All right, let's make this happen. So, control props, they're great. Let's see, what is that command? I need to learn that shortcut. There we go. Ta-da! Okay, so what we need to do is we need to, instead of getting the state of on from our internal state, we'll get it from props. So actually this is pretty easy. This dot props. That's where we're getting our state. And with that, it works. So it's like way easy, right? Okay, we're missing a lot of things. But like conceptually, that's all that you really need to do. So most of what we need to do is involves avoiding unnecessary re-renders. It also involves what if we wanted a toggle, an additional toggle here that was not controlled. So we go here, and now that one doesn't work. Okay, so
it's really easy to just derive your state from props. It's really easy to, yeah, to just get your state from these props. Yeah, weird stuff happening now. But supporting both is where things get a little bit more tricky. Yeah.
So control props, if I don't understand, if I understand correctly, then it means that you set the state from the props and display it from the props.
Yeah, so control props means that you get the state from the props and you provide a mechanism to suggest changes to that state.
And you also maintain an internal state.
So actually no. So you don't want to maintain an internal state. So as soon as an item of state is controlled, you no longer want to be responsible for maintaining that state. Because if you continue to maintain that state, then you could be re-rendering unnecessarily. So for example, let's say that there were more than one way to update this state, and I click on a button to update the state in an alternative method, and the controller of my state decides, no, I don't want you to update. We're going to re-render anyway. In this simple example, like, who cares? Like, it's a tiny little, I mean, it's not even worth the bytes that it would take to send to the user. But in more complex components, that a re-render could be expensive, and so it's just nice to avoid. And because it doesn't take a ton of work to make that happen, then it's worth the effort. So to support both, what we're going to do is we're going to create a getState function, or a method on our class, and we'll just return on is this dot, or sorry, we'll just return this dot props dot on. So if that is equal to undefined, then we'll get it from state. Otherwise, we'll get it from props. Okay, and so now we'll do this dot get state instead of this dot props, and ta-da! Now it all works. Things are like really messed up, I think, because we've got this extra toggle. So I'm going to get rid of that thing. But yeah, so now that makes things a lot nicer, or like we can support both props and state. But we're still managing the state internally, even if it's controlled. So we're going to fix that as well. So in our toggle, we're going to say this dot, or we'll say if this dot props dot on is undefined, then we'll continue to do what we did before we could control any props. Otherwise, we're not going to be calling set state. We don't need to update our state. We're not managing it ourselves anyway. And we'll call this dot props dot on toggle with our suggestion. So we can say based on this dot get state. So based off of the state of on, we want it to be the reverse. And they're like whatever mechanisms you need to determine what your suggestion would be. Okay. And in here we'll do get state for this as well. So with that, everything is working great. Yes, question.
So here we are not changing the state at all for the target function, which means like we are avoiding the re-rendering.
We're overriding the what?
I mean, avoiding the re-rendering.
Oh, Yep. So yeah, now with this implementation, we are actually never calling set state in the toggle. Yep.
If it is controlled.
Sorry?
If it is controlled, I know.
Yeah, if it's controlled. That's right. Yep, and if it's not controlled, then we will manage it ourselves. So if we were to like make two different components, one that is a controlled toggle and, a totally controlled toggle and one that's not, then lots of this code would just like that goes to one, that goes to the other. This is merging the two so you can support both, which gives you a lot of flexibility in a single component. Okay, so I'm going to work through a couple of the extra credit, and then we can move on to the provider pattern. So I'm going to just get rid of some extra comments here. Okay, so in our scenario, it's actually, oh, sorry, there's one other thing before I move on. So we've got some duplicate code here. It'd be nice to just simplify that a little bit. So we're going to have a isControlled function that takes a prop and returns this.props.prop is undefined. And that'll actually not. So it's not undefined. So then we can say this dot is controlled on, and then we'll have to swap these. So this will be props. So if it is controlled, then it'll come from props. Otherwise, it'll come from state. Yeah, this is all messed up. If this dot is controlled on. So if it is controlled, it'll just call our toggle. Otherwise, we'll do this. Okay, cool. So yeah, with our toggle component, it's actually pretty, like, it's contrived. It's just a single item of state. It's not really all that complicated. If we added more state, then we could, like we say, pretty true. Of course our component's pretty. And then we'd come here and say pretty, and we'd do the same thing. We'd just duplicate this. Okay. And so on and so forth for every item of state that we have. And that's probably just fine. But we could maybe enhance this a little bit more to be more flexible. And so rather than type it all out and show off how much I know about JavaScript, just kidding. I'm going to just copy this and explain the code. Because that's really all that it's we're trying to accomplish, is make it so we don't have to hard code all of this stuff, but make it so our get state will just take all of the, like, combine all of the state from props or state regardless of what it is. So it allows us to control every item of state in our component. So this is how it works. Object.entries returns an array of arrays. How many people have used object entries before? Okay. So it's kind of like object.keys, except object.keys, so an object has two things. There's for each property. There's the key and there's the value. So object.keys will give you all of the keys. There's actually an object.values, which is not as, that came out about the same time as object.entries. That'll just give you the values. Object.entries will give you an array that maps the key and the value. So it's an array of arrays. Where item 0 is the key and item 1 is the value. So that's what we're doing here. We're just object entries on our state. So we'll take all of the items on our state and we'll reduce it to a combined state object, which we initialize to an empty object here. And then for each of those entries, those entry entities, that's an array of key and value. So we'll destructure that. And then we can say if it's controlled, if that key is controlled, then we'll take the combined state at the key and we'll get it from props because it's controlled, so it's going to come from props. Otherwise, we'll just assign it to the value. And now this getState function can handle any number of items in our state, and any of those things can be controlled. This is, I'm pretty sure this is exactly what downshift, I'm pretty sure this is straight from downshift. If it's not, then I need to make a pull request to make it this, because this is nice. Yeah, question?
Not related to it, but just it's like bugging from the beginning.
Sure.
So you always add a comma, I mean, at the end,
Oh.
even though there are not now like argument there.
Yeah. So, yeah, the reason for that is, let's go to here. So if we're looking at Git on the side here, when I make changes, I have this nice Git diff thing. Let's say I wanted to add another arg. Well, here now okay. So this is what it would normally look like. If I want to add another arg whatever, then I'm going to have to add a comma there, and now Git will show that I changed 2 lines rather than just 1, and that's annoying to me. So I leverage the function comma, dangle, on function, invocation, whatever. I don't remember what that syntax is called. Yeah, but that actually, I'm pretty sure that syntax is supported in Chrome, but that's Babel transpiles that away for me. So, yep. Fun stuff. Any other questions about this or? Okay, cool. So the next thing that we need to consider with components that are not just a toggle component is we have an on toggle. If we had a like input value here, then we'd have to support a prop called on input value change. And then if we had and anytime we want to call set state, we'll have to do the same logic to avoid unnecessary re-renders. And we'll have to do that same thing anytime we call set state anywhere, all the time. Really annoying. I don't like doing it. And so what we can do instead is very similar to what we did with the state reducer. We'll make our own set state function that will take care of telling consumers when state has been changed, when any state has been changed. So I'm going to make an internal set state method that takes our changes and our callback. And then here I will say this dot set state. We'll take our current state and we'll give it our callback. And we're not doing the state reducer. We can actually combine control props and state reducers, and lots of this code will be like the same. So here we'd call the state reducer and everything. In our case, we just need to get our, let's see, yeah, okay, so here's the challenge with this right here is we're calling this dot set state, but in the case of a controlled prop, we don't actually need it to re-render because we're not managing our state, and so we need to return null if there are no actual changes that are controlled. But there are a couple of things we have to do to get to that point in a generic way that would work regardless of how much state that you have. So in addition to that, we need to, our recommendations for what the state should be based off of our combined state, whether it's coming from props or state, right? And so this state that we're getting from this dot set state is actually not totally accurate. It's what our internal state is, but if some of our props, some of our state is controlled, then that is going to be missing those states. So I'm going to make a combined state variable, and we'll call this dot get state. But this dot get state is using this dot state, which is unreliable during a set state call for batching reasons and things. So what we're going to do is we'll update get state to accept a state argument, and we'll default it to this dot state. So that's just a refactor with additional capabilities. So then we'll pass our state, and that is where we're going to get that combined state, is from the state in our this dot state call. Okay, so now we have the combined state, and so we can get the changes object. If type of changes is a function, then we'll call changes with the combined state. Yeah. Otherwise, it'll just be the changes object that were passed. Okay, so with that, now we're going to return object.keys changes, object.keys changes object. If it has any length, then it's not an empty object, and we'll return the changes object. Otherwise, we'll return null, so we avoid an unnecessary re-render. Okay, so, but we don't want that changes object to have any items of state that are controlled, so we need to separate those things. And here I'm going to go ahead and just copy this again. Okay. So that'll be our changes object. And then we can use the non-controlled changes. Okay, so let me explain this code really quick. It's really similar to our get state. So what this is doing is it's taking all of the entries from the changes object, and initializing a new changes object here, taking the key and the value, and if that is controlled, or if it's not controlled, then that is one item of state that we do want to update. We'll keep that updated. Otherwise, we don't really care. We'll just leave it off because we don't need to manage that state ourselves. And then we'll return the non-controlled changes if there are any. Otherwise, we'll return null if there aren't. And that helps us, or that avoids an unnecessary remember. Okay, cool. Great. So that, I think, is 2 of our extra credits. Oh, not quite, not quite. So that helps us manage only calling or only updating state for the things that we are managing ourselves, but it doesn't help the consumers know when state has been changed for any number of state. So right now we're calling onToggle because the onToggle changed, but like we could have many different things that could change. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make a more generic on state change function that is called anytime any state changes, and it's called with all of the changes that were made. So this callback, after the state has been updated, we'll call the callback, sure, it's fine. But we'll also call this .props.onStateChange. Okay, and we're going to call that with, I can't remember what order I do this in. No, yeah. So we're going to call it with the suggested changes, the changes that we believe should be made to state, as well as all of the state, just as kind of a convenient, all of the current state. So the suggested changes are encapsulated in this changes object that we call internal set state with. And so we could just pass that changes, but that changes could actually be a function. So we don't actually know what the changes object is until we get the current state and combine that into the combined state, and then use that to get the changes object. Okay. So this changes object is what we actually want to call onStateChange with. So what we're going to do is we'll let all changes, and I'm going to say all changes equals the changes object. And then we can call onStateChange with all the changes, and then this dot get state, so the current state. Okay. So now consumers of our API can add a handle change, and that can handle any state change that happens in our component at all. And now it's going to be called with a changes and all the state, all the current state. And then we can say, the consumer could say if the changes has own property on. So of all the things that we could change, if one of those things is the on property, then we're going to update our state to have changes to on. Okay. Cool. This is something that we have implemented in downshifts, and it's really powerful. The alternative would be for all 4 of those items of state, anytime we call this .set state, we'd have this .props.on is open change, and an on is or on input value change, and on everything change. It's like nutso. So if you have more than just one thing of state that you're managing, this is the way to do that, I think. Okay, but we still are incapable of determining what type of change is happening here. So like we know that on is changing, but we don't know why. And so here's where you can add a type property to your state changes, and it's basically the exact same thing we did with state reducer. One thing that I didn't show you earlier, and I'm not sure why, is with the type, I'll just show you the finished version really quick because there's not a whole lot more. But with the type, I don't like people having to hard code type values in their code, like the consumers in my component or even within my own component's code. And so what I do is I create this state change types object, static property, that it basically acts like an enum in JavaScript. It has properties for each type of change that can happen and values that don't actually matter. It could just be numbers or anything. And then I reference those as the types. So here we have this toggle off and toggle on for the type. And then consumers are able to reference those directly without having to like typo a keyword or something like that. Okay. So if we look at actually, just to show you the practical use case of this, it's extra.3 exercises final. So what this enables us to do in this scenario is we can toggle on and off, but then we can make it so that you have to double click that and double click that before the state changes. Okay, so like it's totally contrived, but there are really valid use cases for doing stuff like this in with downshift, where here we have two autocompletes, and I can say here, let's do actually blue. Yeah. So I can control one autocomplete, all of the state of one autocomplete from another text field. And I can control whether that menu is open and closed. I can clear the selection, all from outside of it. So there are a lot of really valuable pieces to being able to control the state of a component from the outside and supporting both use cases. So. Whew. Everybody looks so tired. Okay. Yeah, I think that's it for control props. So before this exercise, the next exercise was to actually take your state reducer that you made and add control prop support to it. It was really complicated. And so I don't do that anymore. But you can look at downshift and see how that's accomplished. It's actually not that complicated, but I figured that you could figure it out if you needed to. So lots of the things that you need to do to support one actually help you support the other, especially with the state change type stuff. So okay, so we just have two more exercises. It is almost 3 o'clock. And these two are pretty lightweight. So I think we can do them both, and you won't lose your brains. So number 11, this is the provider pattern, and this is actually the reason most people use Redux, is because Redux implements the provider pattern. Redux allows you, because Redux implements a provider pattern for you, it allows you to access your data anywhere in the application tree without having to prop drill all over the place. So what do I mean by that? Oh, rats. Let me see if I think I kind of I ruined the reason why this matters, or my explanation of prop drilling. Here, let's do. I have it in my Git history, so let's go back in time a little bit before I refactored a bunch of stuff. Okay, browse files. Here we go. So we have the provider pattern. Okay, so here is a very simple example of prop drilling, what that is and how it can sometimes be a problem. So we have our toggle, and it's a render prop, and it's awesome. We love it. But we decided we need to refactor things a little bit, separate things, because it's easier when it's not all one giant render function sometimes. And so we created this component. We'll call it layer 1 because we're as contrived as possible. And layer 1 has to accept on and toggle because some of its descendants need to have those props. But layer 2 doesn't actually need those things, so we just forward those onto layer 2. Or sorry, layer 1 doesn't need those, so we just forward those onto layer 2. And layer 2 uses the on prop to do some of its work and then forwards those onto layer 3. Layer 3 forwards those onto layer 4, and then layer 4 actually uses them, right? So this is, you're drilling the props down to where they're needed in the React component tree. And the problem that this can that can happen here is if you need to change this one so it no longer accepts an on prop, you just remove it. But then you have to remember to go to layer 3 and say, oh, I don't need to pass it anymore. And in fact, it doesn't even need it anymore. And so then you go to layer 2 and you say, okay, layer 3 doesn't need the on prop anymore. Okay, great. But then let's say you need to do the reverse and you say, oh, I need that on prop after all. I need to go to layer 4 and add that, and then I got to go to layer 3 and accept that, and it's like super annoying. So that's the prop drilling problem. This is not a valid use case to use the provider pattern. This is very contrived. Drilling just a couple layers is not a problem. It's like not a big deal. But there are situations like, for example, the user's language. Maybe, let's say that's some dynamic data, like the user can change their language preferences, and now you have to update everywhere all over your component. Or if you have a theming situation where you're like, here are the colors for my theme, and that can change on the fly. Any data that can change and needs to be accessed in many places, that's where you use Redux or the provider pattern. Like I always talk about this, if you're using Redux to solve this problem and nothing else, for no other reason, then stop using Redux. Just use context. Redux solves other problems, and if you're having those problems, feel free to use Redux, but don't use it to solve this problem because context is a much easier solution. Yeah, was there a comment, question?
Well, I was going to actually ask this when we were going over the context, but do they call it the context app provider for the same reason that the Redux called there?
Yeah.
Like, kind of similar in that it fits around or whatever that.
Yeah, I'm not sure where they decided like, oh, let's call it provider, but I'm like pretty 99% certain that they said, so it's been a couple years, we've had this old context API, we never liked it, let's rewrite it, and we've seen that in the community this pattern has emerged. It's the provider pattern. And so it makes sense to call this a provider and to call this a consumer. So that's probably why they named it those things. But we could ask Andrew. You could tweet him and be like, hey, where'd that come from? Yeah, okay, so what we want to have for this API is if layer 1 doesn't need that prop, then it doesn't get that prop. And in fact, we've changed the toggle API to not be a render prop API anymore. Okay, if you want access to toggle stuff, then you're going to use the consumer. Okay, so layer 1 doesn't get it. Layer 1 just renders layer 2. It doesn't need to pass any props. Layer 2 gets all the information it needs from the toggle consumer. It pulls out the on prop. This is a render prop thing. Renders our fragment and then on and layer 3. And then layer 3 just renders layer 4. We're not passing any props. In fact, we're not just not prop drilling. We're not passing props at all. We're just using the consumer to get our state. So that's the API you're going to build. And there's a whole bunch of extra credit that you can add on. And I've got, if you want to, look at all the solutions for those extra credit too. But yeah, your basic implementation should be fairly straightforward, and with your practice earlier this morning with the compound components, I think you should be able to get this one pretty quick. So we'll go for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and go through this. Feel free to get as much of the extra credit done as you can, and if you don't even finish the regular exercise, that's totally fine too. So to get this started, we're going to pop open we got a dog in here. Yeah, it's really here, let's see, I forgot the hotkey. There we go. So to get this started, we're going to go the p key 11.js and then swap our usage for the final to the usage of the exercise, and now we can start. There's something broken on what? Oh, yes, there is. That is intentional because you haven't done your job yet. So yeah, when you open this up, it's going to blow up because we are no longer doing the render prop API. This is just going to be provider pattern. One of the extra credit points is to support both the provider pattern and the render prop API and compound components. That's a lot of fun. I've actually got a blog post about that. Yeah, actually, I just posted it. I think it was this last week's blog post. mixing component patterns. And this little code sandbox supports compound components, render props, component injection, which we're not talking about today, the provider pattern, and higher order components. All of these result in the same thing, but they're using a different API that's exposed from the same component. So that's kind of fun. If you want to check out the one with Candy, that's the blog post. So anyway, yeah, a couple minutes for this one.
So just trying to understand how so this is my data and I have like so the concept of like the process is stored and the way it is the also passing the data out of the layer is expected as a object. So in this pattern, so you're saying use index, this is the way without using index. That's what they're trying to say.
It's in general solving a problem where you can provide a value to any layer and get that out. So Freenet, they provide a higher order component to have each of this context universe and some context strings. And users of our talking about will see the consumer, but they won't see the provider, right? So they'll just see the talking about. And then extra credit, we kind of obscure the consumer as well. And then in the higher order component, we just make it a higher order component that branches the consumer.
That's it. And to define page on the page is containing defined So that whenever we define any of these components in JSON, it's the store access. Okay. And the store has a different flow. When we are making an API call, that responds to story, to the store. For example, I'm also put up in one of the objects that was so that I understand this letter on all our global status, letter on all the components that are here. But that's one way we solve the problem. Is, we don't have control of, say, this is one of the JSON which I want to show you. So this is one piece. So what we say is this is our sequence approach. The back. Like you see the this is exactly the
Okay, so user cases, type cases.
exactly. So if I don't have a table component access something it's connected components to, if you don't have access, there's no clue of what can be connected.
Right, so in this JSON, can you like how do you dispatch updates and things like that?
That's it. So just the one export. Oh, dispatch.
Yeah,
All
like,
the
yeah.
so take a simple example. So one I thought that I did wrong, and once the review of the data, this is actually statement. Here I got the data, which value, and just resolve it, and
Okay, no.
so it's a little bit complicated.
It is kind of complicated. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I would honestly, I would have to have like some more time to look at that.
Yep. So, but I think still we are using Redux, and I will totally remove those kind of things, perhaps we will down only the element and send the global store to all the components. Let's do this carry for the avoid in future.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, like, there are use cases for Redux. Like, there's cool use cases for Redux. But yeah, I just generally most of the time Redux brings more complex to figure out and simplifies.
What do you think of the that's used?
Yeah, most people in React use Redux, but like I would say 80% of people using Redux are just really just.
And the thing is, any simple props changes. 80% of component is related in a page. I just keep on reading.
Yeah.
I try to avoid it, but you won't see it in a simple app. But in consumer using it, you see a lot of slowness.
Because of Redux.
Yeah. Because I love how everything is connected. So you change a simple props, all your components will be.
That's so there's Redux and then there's overusing even Redux. So like putting more state into Redux that belongs there.
Anything you change on the state, your components are
Yeah. Yeah. Redux should really only hold state that needs to be global.
exactly.
Okay, cool. So let us solve this one. So we're going to make our toggle context. Oops. And that's going to be react.create context. And I'm going to start out by providing a default. So on is false, and toggle is just this empty arrow function. And then if we look at our usage here, we're using toggle.consumer. This is just a convention that I like to follow. You don't have to do this to use this API, but I like to associate the component that's using my provider with the consumer. And so I'm going to make a static consumer equals toggle context.consumer. And then here in my render method, I'm going to just replace this whole thing. But we'll start out with the toggle context.provider. And our value will just be the same thing we're passing to our children. And then we'll spread the rest of the props so we can apply the children. Okay, and that's all that we need to get our test passing and to get the functionality that we're looking for. Oops. Which is that. Okay, so everything's working now. Okay, so before I talk about some of the considerations and changes that we're going to make, does anybody have questions? Okay, cool. So we talked earlier about unnecessary re-renders. In the provider pattern, this becomes a lot more serious because if you're going to use the provider pattern, then it's quite likely that you have situations where you're going to have many consumers. And the more consumers you have, the more unnecessary re-renders can be a problem performance-wise. And so we're going to, instead of providing a new value every single render, we're going to provide this dot state. And then we'll move our state below here so we can include toggle in our state. Okay, so that will help avoid unnecessary re-renders. It only re-renders when the state changes.
You have to do that if you're not using the class prop syntax and then just using it as a method on the class?
If you're using what as a method? Sorry.
Like not
Oh.
using
You mean if it was...
you need to bring the state down still.
Oh, yeah, good question. No, you don't. So if you're not using this inside of here, then no, you don't, because it's an order of operations thing. So if we do constructor args super args, and we move this here, this dot. So at this point, when the constructor is running, our toggle class, the prototype, has already been instantiated, and so this already has access to all prototypal properties. The reason that we have to change their order when it's like this is because now it's not on the prototype, it's on the instance, and it hasn't been added to the instance yet. So that's why yeah. Cool, so let's just clean this up because this is a mess. I pretty much never use constructors because they're lame. I don't know. That wasn't a nice thing to say. But you don't need them most of the time when you got these class properties. Super nice. Okay, so just a quick comment about the way that I'm rendering this, because I don't think I mentioned it earlier. But when you're doing the provider, rendering a provider like this, it's a really great idea to enable users of your provider component to override the value. The only real use case for that I can think of is for testing. So now in my tests, I can render this toggle and provide an override for the value so that I can test how my consumers respond when the value is has a certain state. So yeah, writing it like this so the value can be overridden is pretty useful. Okay, let's see. So the next thing that would be nice that I'm not going to talk about because we already did is validating that the consumer is not called outside of the context of a provider, because that wouldn't really make sense either. It'll fail silently. So I would probably throw an error and say, hey, you need to render this inside of a consumer. But we already did that with the compound component, so I'm going to skip that. And we handled this one, unnecessary re-renders. So support render props as well. This one's actually pretty easy. So here we can get our UI equals this.props.children. We're going to say type of, or actually, let's make this easier. Const children equals this.props. And then we'll say our UI is type of children is a function. If it is, then we'll say children with this.state. Otherwise, just children. And then here, let's see, we'll say the rest of the props, and we'll spread the rest across, and then we'll just stick our UI right there. So that now supports both render props and the provider pattern. It's kind of fun. It's nice to do that. And then we could support compound components as well. I think you could figure out how to do that on your own. So yeah, maybe I'll just show you really quick. Pretty straightforward. So here we have the validation of our consumer. We are sticking the consumer on here, and then we just have our compound components like we had before. But then we're also rendering the provide, or we're also doing this render props, and then we can use instead of using the consumer, we can actually use these compound components, which is kind of cool. We can have a mix of all kinds of things. Okay, great. Any questions or thoughts or comments or concerns? Okay, so this is the second to last bit of elaboration and feedback that you need to leave. This is, I'll just give you a couple seconds to go through that. Try to think critically about what it is that you learned and write what you would like yourself to remember. Okay, so what did you learn? I should have learned all your names first and then like, you. Well, I guess I can still do that at this point. You are looking at me. What did you learn? Yeah, just look away if you don't want to get called on.
Still putting my head through the current React concept. I very much used to the Redux. So I will even realized React can do all these powerful things.
Oh, that's so good to hear you say, or it's not necessarily good, but that's a very common feeling that I hear a lot. You get so used to using Redux that you forget, okay, where's the line between React and Redux, and how much of this can be accomplished with just React. Yep. Yeah, that's why you have people like me screaming, no, you don't need Redux for that. React can do it by itself.
I think I need to go over the YouTube video, eagerly waiting for this.
Yeah.
Start from the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, review it again. So there is like, if you can get your manager to pay for front-end masters or Egghead.io, highly recommended because there will be like higher quality recordings on those platforms. I do my best with this, but like I don't got a nice mic or anything. So, anybody else want to say something they learned or ask a question?
I mean, I think it's just they all build on each other in some ways. So I think just kind of seeing how, for example, you can use render props with compound components, or just how any of the lessons kind of can interact with one another to form a more sophisticated component.
Yeah, totally. You can mix and match all of these patterns, like whether it's the render specific ones, like that's what my blog post is about. Here are all the render specific patterns. You can put them all together. But also state reducer and control props, state initializers, all of those things can kind of be mixed and matched to make highly flexible components. Now, I wouldn't recommend necessarily for all of your components doing stuff like this. And the other thing is, like, some of these patterns aren't just useful for reusable components either. I found render props especially is a good way to separate logic from UI. Even if I'm only going to use this thing in one place, it's still a nice way for me to separate in my mind the logic from the UI. And so I found that to be useful as well. But yeah, if you're going to be mixing and matching these things, your component better be like very reusable. And those use cases should probably be actual use cases and not just like, look at how cool this. It's like having a car that can go 500 miles an hour. Like, that's great, bud, but I hope you never go that fast. So yeah, so take that into consideration. Okay, so we're on our last one, and that's higher order components. This actually, when I first created this material, higher order components was like half of the material. Because first off, before React 16.3, it was a lot harder to make higher order components. There were a lot more things that you had to do, and it's like confusing and hard to explain. And after React 16.3, they added 2 APIs that made things a lot easier. And so, yeah, now it's a fair amount simpler. So what we have here is our provider pattern that we just built. The basic thing, it doesn't have all the compound components or the validation or anything. And then we have this function called with_toggle. And there's a fair amount of stuff you still have to do with this, but hopefully the comments will help guide you along exactly what you need to do to accomplish this. But a higher order component is a function, not a component. So that's kind of weird. But it's a function that accepts anything. It can accept a component, it can accept an object, it can accept a string, anything. And all that really matters is that it returns a component. And lots of higher order components are like, they return wrapper components, and that's what ours is going to do. Like the React Redux Connect returns a wrapper component. Styled components, emotion, glamorous, those are all mostly React or higher order components. The React implementation is higher order components. So you'd say glamorous.div, you invoke that. That's a higher order component that you're creating, a component that has its styles. So yeah, our higher order component simply needs to access the context of the toggle and then provide that to this component, rendering that component with a toggle prop. So we can see the usage example here. We have this with toggle, and this is a function component. It's accepting a toggle prop, and we're destructuring it further down to get the on property. So if I were to render this toggle or this layer 2 and provide that, it'd be toggle on is false, right? So that's what I'm kind of trying to build, except we don't have to pass those props. The with toggle is going to handle providing that. So we no longer have to use the toggle consumer. And that's pretty much the only change, is just removing the toggle consumer and using with toggle instead. There are a bunch of considerations here. Some of these probably should be like extra credit, honestly. Let me see really quick. Yeah, pretty much all that you need to do to get this higher order component functional is this first one. The rest of these are optimizations for handling certain use cases that may or may not ever come up anyway. Okay, so yeah, it's actually, I'll just ask really quick. Just feeling the temperature of the room a little bit. Who wants to have some time to work on this yourself? Absolutely nobody wants to work on this themselves. Okay, I'm glad that I asked. I'll just work through it for you then, and then we can call it a day. 12.js. So Here's how you implement a higher order component. Oh, here, actually, let me go back. I was like, why is my test passing? Okay, tests are broken. Good. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a function called wrapper, and that's going to accept some props. And that function is what we're going to return. This is a function component. It's pretty simple. We're providing this state to context, and we want to access that through the consumer. So we're going to return toggle.consumer. Toggle consumer. And the child is going to be a function that accepts our context value, which I'm going to actually destructure to just get, or actually no, I'm not going to destructure it. I'm just going to call it the toggle context. There we go. And this is going to render my component. And we'll render it with a toggle prop, toggle context. And we'll also want to render any props that our wrapper is rendered with. That will support the case where if I did say like foo bar, because layer 2 is now actually the wrapper, because that's what we're returning from with toggle. Okay, so we want to forward any other props to the underlying component. And that's actually a pretty important point. The whole idea of a wrapper higher order component like this is you want to make believe that the component people are dealing with is not the wrapper, but it's the actual function component. So everything that we do from here on out is striving to make that possible. Because if you don't, it can be pretty confusing for people using this component. Like especially with the connect higher order component and things, and the with router from React Router, if the component that you get back doesn't resemble the one that it's wrapping, then that can be really confusing. Yeah, this is actually all that we need for our higher order component to function. Ta-da! Used to be a lot more, but now it's a fair amount simpler. Any questions so far? Okay, so yeah, here are a couple of additional things we need to do. So refs. We don't often actually use refs on React component instances. Normally you'll use a ref to get a DOM node. But we don't often use a ref to get a component instance. But it's possible to do that, and if you want your component to be reusable, you probably want to support it. Before React 16.3, you had to do this really funky thing to make that work, and it didn't even really work. But now with React 16.3, we have this new API called forward ref. So what we're going to do is I'm going to return react.forward ref on that wrapper. And then now the wrapper is a component, but it also accepts a ref property. And now that ref we can forward onto the component. So now if somebody puts a ref on layer 2, say ref, so whatever, that ref will actually be applied to the underlying component, which is this function component. So in this case, you can't actually have a ref on a function component. It's only on a class component or a composite or a DOM component. But yeah, now we can support that. Thank you, React 16.3. Okay, so one thing that's kind of annoying, let's save that. If you open up the DevTools, I'm going to go to exercise isolated, and go to React. The React DevTools. It's really cool because React will show you the display name of the components that are on the page. But we are missing some of these names. They're not very helpful. So here's unknown. That one's not helpful. Let's fix that one really quick. As a user, I actually have control of that. So I say function layer 2. And now because it's a named function, I can't have the implicit arrow anymore, which is kind of sad. And now Hold it. Oh, there it is. Layer 2. Ta-da! That's great. So there's nothing that we as the higher order component user can do to make the component that they're giving us have a better name, because we don't know what it should be. With styled components in Glamorous and Emotion, their higher order components actually come with a Babel plugin, which will set the display name automatically for you, which is kind of cool. So it'll look at what are you calling this thing, that's what the display name should be. And that's actually how React does it too. That's how React knows that, or no, that's not true. That's how they used to do it with React Create class, but they don't need to do that anymore. So anyway, yeah, so there's not much we can do short of making a Babel plugin to make that work nicely. But there are other display names here that are not very useful, like forward ref wrapper. That wrapper, we're supposed to make that wrapper invisible. So what we're going to do is we need to give that a nice display name. So we can do that with wrapper.displayName. And if you've used higher order components in the past, most of the time the way they make their display names is the name of the higher order component. Well, they basically do, they kind of make it resemble this. So with toggle and then the name of the component that you're wrapping. So here we're going to say component.name or component.displayName. Actually, that's in reverse. Name. You want the display name first. Okay, so now we say forward ref with toggle layer 2 here. So like I said, we can only do as good as the components that they give us. They're not giving us what the name of that component is. That's why this is unknown and that's undefined. But yeah, so now we see, oh, this is a component that forwards the ref, and it's a with toggle higher order component that's wrapping the layer 2, which is nice. We could do something similar with the context.consumer. We give that a different display name. Just for funsies, let's do it. Say toggle.consumer, or yeah, various ways. Display name equals toggle consumer. And then that reloads, and boo! Okay, it actually never tried that before, and it looks like it doesn't work. So, what? I don't know. I must be doing something wrong, because I actually feel like I have tried that before and it did work. So I have to go look at it later, figure out. But yeah, anyway, that's display name stuff for improved React DevTools. And then one last thing, and that is with static properties on class components. So if I change this layer 2 into a static component, let's just do it really quick. So I'll say class extends react.component, then render, return that thing. Oh, whoops, return. And we'll get toggle on this.props. Okay, so that is functionally equivalent. It's just we moved from a function component to a class component. Now this class component can have static properties. So static on message equals the button is on, and static off message equals the button is off. Okay, and now how do we access those static properties? Well, we're supposed to assume that what we get back from the with toggle is the same component as, or the same component as the one that we're creating. So we should be able to just say layer 2 dot on message and layer 2 dot off message. Okay, but that does not work. It's gone, and that's because layer 2 is not the component that has those static properties. It is the wrapper, which has no static properties. Well, I guess it has display name. But so what we need to do is take all the static properties that the component we're accepting has and hoist them up to the wrapper. That's why we have this handy little module called hoist non-react statics to solve exactly this problem. So let's do that. We'll return hoist non-react statics of that component we get back from forward ref onto from that component that we're getting here. And now everything works. Ta-da! And now consumers of components that are wrapped with this with toggle can pretty much just assume that that component is this thing. And this is why people who've written higher order components don't like them. Because it's like all this junk. It's really confusing. But it's not all that bad. It used to be a lot worse. It's a lot better now. So that's a higher order component. There you have it. Higher order components are pretty handy for situations where you're like, you have a lot of boilerplate around components. One thing that I think is really important, an important takeaway, is higher order components are probably the least flexible of all the patterns because you have to generate, yeah, it's not dynamic. There's no dynamic composition with this. So you have to create the component first, and then you can render it. Whereas with render props, you're re-rendering that thing like every single render. You can do all kinds of composition with that. With this, you have to know ahead of time all the options that you want. Now, there are things that like React Redux does, for example, where you have map state to props and map props to dispatch. And those are the dynamic pieces that you would care about anyway using those components, that higher order component. So they expose those functions so that they can, in their own wrapper, they can do that dynamic composition stuff for you. And so quite honestly, if I had a choice between a higher order component with Redux and a render prop, I'd probably use the higher order component because most of the time I don't need the dynamic composition. So there are use cases for higher order components, but there are problems with them too. So that's why it's nice to implement the render prop first, and then if people want, you can have a higher order component that uses the render prop in this manner, and then you can have both.
That's an opinion that I've kind of had, but I've often heard that stance of render props do everything higher order components do, and they do it better. And I'm not advanced enough to really dispute that, but it's a bold claim, I guess. It just feels like they both have like a place.
They
I'm
do.
not saying that a render prop can't do it, but maybe it feels more.
Yeah, it's cleaner. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah. So if I can choose one, I'll choose the render prop every time. But because I don't normally have to choose one, yeah, I don't see a problem with exposing both.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so as a last thing that you can do for this is try to take all of the patterns that you learned and implement them in a single component. And then, and just like a toggle component. And then when you finish with that, try to take that component and switch it from managing the state of a Boolean, just the on state, to Redux or to something much bigger. I think Redux is good because it can, it's a really great demonstration of, oh wow, all these components could actually manage the state of my entire application. That's kind of cool. So that's a great exercise. I don't have an actual exercise or example for you to do that, except there is that blog post I showed you earlier right here that will show you the UI piece of that, so you can check that out later. But yeah, that's it. So I have one more slide for you. Ta-da! Thank you so much for coming.
That's good.
Anybody have any last questions or anything? You want to see a picture of my dog again? No, just kidding. Thanks, streamers. Let's see.
Stance. Yeah, but that's still, that's not a reason to not use the class. I just was curious if you guys have the same architecture.
Like required to change the path. No, I don't think so. We haven't looked into the high path like this.
But you guys are like 99% functions.
No. Most of it, I have to say, yeah.
That's how we are too. It's,
Okay, I'm gonna close out. Thanks everybody.
Except for the-
Bye.